The night sky over Coventry glowed red with anticipation, though the city below had no way of knowing what was coming. November 14, 1940. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the blackout curtains hung heavy in every window, transforming England's industrial heartland into a darkened maze of silhouettes and shadows. At precisely 7:20 in the evening, the first sound emerged from the distance. A low, mechanical drone that seemed to rise from the earth itself, growing louder with each passing second. Then came the others, hundreds of them, Heinkel 111s and Dornier bombers, their engines synchronized in a terrible chorus that made the ground tremble and the windows rattle in their frames. They crossed the English Channel in perfect formation, flying through clouds that should have made navigation impossible, through darkness that should have blinded them. Yet they came on with the precision of a surgeon's scalpula, guided by something invisible, something that turned the night itself into their roadmap. The people of Coventry heard them overhead, that awful crescendo of German engines, and then the whistling began, hundreds of bombs falling through the cold November air, and when they struck with impossible accuracy. The cathedral, the factories, the residential blocks, each target found, each payload delivered exactly where the Luftwaffe intended. By dawn, the city would be ash and rubble, 568 dead, and thousands more wounded or homeless. But what made this raid different, what made it a nightmare beyond the usual horror of aerial bombardment, was that the Germans had done this without seeing their targets, without breaking through the clouds, without the moon to guide them. They had done it with invisible beams of radio energy that carved pathways through the sky, and standing in a cramped office in Whitehall, listening to the reports crackling over military radios, a young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones knew exactly how they had done it, and knew that no one in power believed him. Jones was 28 years old, thin and pale with the kind of face that suggested he spent more time with equations than with people, which was precisely true. He had joined the British Air Ministry's Scientific Intelligence Section barely a year earlier, plucked from academic obscurity because someone in the government had finally realized that this war would not be won by courage alone. The Second World War was transforming into something unprecedented, a conflict where physics mattered as much as firepower, where a man with a slide rule could be worth 100 tanks. Jones understood this intuitively. He had studied at Oxford under some of Britain's finest minds, specializing in infrared physics and the behavior of electromagnetic radiation, subjects that seemed hopelessly esoteric until Hitler's Luftwaffe began appearing over British cities with uncanny precision. Jones had been tracking something for months now, a whisper in the intercepted German communications, a pattern that didn't quite make sense until suddenly it did. The Germans had developed a radio beam navigation system, something they called Knickebein, crooked leg, and they were using it to guide their bombers across the channel and directly onto British targets. The system worked like an invisible railway in the sky. Ground stations in occupied Europe transmitted narrow radio beams across England, and German aircraft equipped with special receivers could follow these beams directly to their targets, flying blind through clouds and darkness yet arriving with the accuracy of a train pulling into a station. It was elegant, it was revolutionary, and it was decimating British cities. But convincing anyone of this was another matter entirely. Jones worked in a building that reeked of cigarette smoke and damp paper, where typists clattered away on mechanical keyboards and military officers moved through hallways with the weary determination of men who had been fighting a losing war since Dunkirk. The atmosphere was thick with doubt and exhaustion. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and America remained stubbornly neutral. Every night, German bombers crossed the channel and dropped their payloads on British cities, and every morning, crews shoveled rubble and pulled bodies from collapsed buildings. The Blitz had become a grim routine, and in that environment, Jones's theories about invisible radio beams sounded like something from a pulp science fiction magazine. When he tried to explain the concept to senior officers, he could see their eyes glaze over. Radio beams? Navigating by wireless signals? They had submarines to worry about, they had the threat of invasion, they had 1,000 immediate crises, and here was this young scientist babbling about electromagnetic radiation. Even when Jones presented evidence, intercepted German documents, prisoner interrogations that mentioned Knickebein, radio frequency measurements that suggested beam transmissions from the continent, the response was skepticism bordering on mockery. One general told him flatly that if such a system existed, British scientists would have invented it first. Another suggested that Jones was seeing patterns where none existed, that he was too young and too eager to make his mark to see clearly. The most damaging response came from Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, who dismissed the entire theory as impossible. Lindemann was a formidable figure, an Oxford physicist with the ear of the Prime Minister himself, and his word carried immense weight. If Lindemann said radio beam navigation was fantasy, then it was fantasy, regardless of what evidence Jones had accumulated. But Jones was not easily discouraged. He had the kind of mind that saw connections others missed, that could take fragments of information and assemble them into coherent pictures. He spent his days and nights in his office, surrounded by towers of intercepted German signals intelligence, radio frequency logs, and technical reports captured from downed Luftwaffe aircraft. The walls were covered with maps of England marked with bombing patterns, and Jones would stand before them for hours, plotting the German raids, searching for the underlying logic. The bombs weren't falling randomly. There was too much precision, too much consistency. Cities like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool were being hit repeatedly, and the Germans were finding their targets even when weather conditions made visual navigation impossible. Jones began collecting every scrap of intelligence that mentioned German navigation systems. Prisoner interrogations yielded cryptic references to special equipment that allowed pilots to find their targets. Captured Luftwaffe aircraft contained mysterious radio receivers tuned to specific frequencies. Ultra-decrypts, the top-secret intelligence gathered from broken German codes, occasionally mentioned beam systems, though the references were vague and incomplete. Jones became obsessed. He worked 16-hour days, surviving on tea and sandwiches, barely sleeping, driven by the conviction that he was right and that every day wasted meant more British civilians would die. His colleagues began to worry about him. His supervisor suggested he take a few days off, get some rest, stop driving himself into the ground over what might be a wild goose chase. But Jones refused. He could feel the truth just beyond his grasp, could sense that he was close to something that would change everything. The breakthrough came in June 1940, weeks before Coventry, when British intelligence intercepted a detailed German technical document describing the Knickerbein system. The document had been found in a crashed bomber, and it contained precise specifications: beam width, transmission frequencies, operational range, and guidance protocols. Jones read it 3 times, his hands shaking slightly because this was it. This was the proof he needed. The document confirmed everything he had theorized. The Germans were transmitting 2 overlapping radio beams across England. A bomber flying along the main beam would hear a steady signal in its receiver. If it drifted left, it would hear Morse dots. If it drifted right, it would hear dashes. By keeping the signal steady, the pilot could stay on the beam and follow it directly to the target. A second beam, transmitted from a different location, would cross the first beam over the target area. When the bomber's receiver picked up both beams simultaneously, the bombardier knew to release his payload. It was simple, it was brilliant, and it explained everything. The bombing patterns, the accuracy in bad weather, the ability to hit targets through cloud cover, it all made sense now. Jones immediately requested a meeting with the Air Ministry's senior leadership. He needed to brief them on this discovery, needed to convince them that Britain was facing a technological threat unlike anything they had encountered before. But getting that meeting took weeks of bureaucratic maneuvering. The war machine moved slowly, and junior scientists did not simply walk into the offices of air marshals and demand attention. Finally, in mid-June, Jones was granted an audience. He was given 15 minutes to present his findings to a room full of senior military officers and government officials, including Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, the man responsible for Fighter Command, and several members of Churchill's war cabinet. Jones walked into that room carrying a briefcase stuffed with evidence, his heart pounding, knowing that this was his only chance. If he failed to convince them, if they dismissed him again, British cities would continue to burn while he sat helpless in his office. The room was imposing. High ceilings, dark wood paneling. A long polished table where men in uniform sat with expressions of polite skepticism. Jones was introduced as a junior scientific officer with a theory about German navigation systems, and he could feel the weight of their doubt before he even opened his mouth. He began speaking, laying out the evidence methodically, the intercepted documents, the prisoner statements, the radio frequency measurements, the bombing patterns. He explained how Nicobine worked, drawing diagrams on a chalkboard, showing how two intersecting beams could guide a bomber to a target with the precision of a railway schedule. He spoke quickly, aware that his 15 minutes were evaporating, aware that he was losing some of them. He could see it in their faces, the confusion, the impatience. Then someone interrupted him. It was Lindemann, Churchill's scientific advisor, the man whose opposition had stymied Jones for months. Lindemann stood and stated that the entire concept was physically impossible. Radio beams, he argued, could not be transmitted with the narrow focus Jones was describing. The wavelengths involved would cause the beams to spread and diffuse over long distances, making precise navigation impossible. It was basic physics, Lindemann said, and Jones was simply mistaken. The room seemed to accept this pronouncement. Men nodded, shuffled papers, prepared to move on to other business. But Jones did not back down. He had anticipated this objection, had spent sleepless nights working through the mathematics, and he knew Lindemann was wrong. Jones stood his ground and, in a voice that was remarkably steady given the circumstances, explained that Lindemann's calculations were based on incorrect assumptions about the German beam system. The Lorenz company, which manufactured the Nicobine equipment, had developed a way to focus the beams using directional antennas and carefully chosen frequencies. Jones had the technical specifications captured from German documents, and they showed conclusively that the system worked exactly as he described. He locked eyes with Lindemann and said with quiet intensity that if they did not act on this intelligence, if they continued to dismiss it as fantasy, then British cities would continue to be destroyed with surgical precision, and the blood of those civilians would be on their hands. The room fell silent. Jones had just accused some of the most powerful men in Britain of ignoring evidence that could save lives, and in that moment he was certain he had just ended his career. But then Air Marshal Dowding spoke. Dowding was a careful, methodical man, famous for his role in defending Britain during the Battle of Britain, and he said simply that if there was even a chance Jones was correct, they could not afford to ignore it. Dowding asked Jones what he needed to prove his theory conclusively. Jones replied immediately, access to a radio detection aircraft and permission to search for the German beam signals. If the beams existed, he could find them. Dowding glanced around the room, saw no objections, and gave his approval. Jones had his chance. Within 48 hours, Jones was aboard a specially equipped RAF Anson aircraft, flying over the English countryside with a team of radio operators and detection equipment. The plan was straightforward. Fly across the areas where Jones believed the German beams would be transmitted, scan the relevant radio frequencies, and see if they could pick up the signals. It was early evening when they took off, the sun setting behind them as they climbed to altitude. Jones sat in the cramped cabin, wearing a bulky headset, surrounded by radio receivers and oscilloscopes that filled the aircraft with a faint electronic hum. The radio operators were skeptical but professional, going through their tasks with quiet efficiency. Jones gave them the frequencies to monitor, the ones specified in the captured German documents, and told them to watch for any continuous signal that exhibited the characteristics of a beam transmission. For the first hour, they found nothing. Static, commercial broadcasts, random noise, but no beam. Jones felt doubt creeping in. What if Lindemann was right? What if the whole theory was based on misinterpreted intelligence? What if he had just humiliated himself in front of the Air Ministry's leadership for nothing? But then, just as the last light faded from the western horizon, one of the radio operators gestured urgently. He was picking up something, a steady signal on one of the target frequencies, emanating from the direction of continental Europe. Jones grabbed a spare headset and listened. There it was, a continuous, modulated tone, exactly what a beam transmission should sound like. The pilot banked the aircraft, following Jones's instructions, and as they flew along the invisible beam, the signal grew stronger and more distinct. When they drifted off course, the signal changed, dots to the left, dashes to the right, just as the German technical documents had described. Jones felt a surge of elation mixed with horror. He had been right. The beam was real. And if this beam was operational, then others were too, crisscrossing England every night, guiding German bombers to their targets. They flew for another 2 hours, mapping the beam's path, and found that it pointed directly toward a major industrial center in the Midlands. Jones radioed the findings back to Whitehall immediately, and by the time they landed, the Air Ministry was in emergency session. Jones's discovery had transformed everything. The skeptics were silenced, Lindemann was forced to reconsider his position, and suddenly Jones, the junior scientist who had been dismissed and doubted, was at the center of Britain's defensive strategy. But there was no time for vindication or celebration. The knowledge that the Germans possessed this technology was one thing. Countering it was another entirely. Jones was immediately tasked with developing a response. How do you fight an invisible weapon? How do you defend against something you cannot see, something that operates in the electromagnetic spectrum beyond human perception? Jones's mind raced through the possibilities. The most obvious solution was to jam the German beams, transmit powerful radio signals on the same frequencies to overwhelm the German receivers and render the beams useless. But that approach had limitations. If Britain jammed the beams too obviously, the Germans would realize their system had been compromised and would likely switch to different frequencies or develop countermeasures. Worse, heavy-handed jamming might provoke the Germans into escalating their bombing campaign or developing even more sophisticated guidance systems. Jones needed something subtler, something that would defeat the beams without alerting the Germans that their secret weapon had been discovered. And then, in one of those flashes of insight that define careers, Jones conceived of a plan that was as audacious as it was brilliant. Instead of blocking the German beams, he would bend them. The idea was deceptively simple but fiendishly difficult to execute. Jones proposed transmitting false signals on the same frequencies as the German beams, but slightly offset in timing and direction. If done correctly, these false signals would interfere with the genuine German beams in a way that would confuse the bomber crews without making them realize they were being deceived. The German pilots would think they were following their navigation beams accurately, but in reality, they would be flying slightly off course. Not dramatically, just a few degrees, but enough to make them miss their targets by miles. The bombs would still fall, but they would fall on empty fields instead of crowded cities. It was a kind of technological judo, using the enemy's own weapon against them by making tiny, invisible adjustments that would have devastating consequences. Jones called it meakening, a term borrowed from the technique of rebroadcasting enemy signals to confuse navigation. But implementing this strategy required resources, technical expertise, and most importantly, absolute secrecy. Jones assembled a small team of scientists and engineers, all sworn to silence, all working under conditions of extreme security. They called themselves 80 Wing, a deliberately mundane designation that concealed the importance of their work. Operating out of a requisitioned country estate south of London, they worked around the clock to build the transmitters and receivers needed to detect and manipulate the German beams. The technical challenges were immense. Jones needed transmitters powerful enough to reach German aircraft at altitude but precise enough to mimic the characteristics of the authentic German beams. He needed radio operators skilled enough to identify and lock onto the German signals in real time, then inject the false signals at exactly the right moment. He needed to calculate the precise angles and timings that would bend the beams without being so obvious that the Germans would notice. And he needed to do all of this while German bombs were falling on British cities every night, while the pressure mounted, while everyone from Churchill down to the radio operators was watching to see if this brilliant young scientist could actually deliver on his promises. Jones barely slept. He existed in a state of perpetual urgency, fueled by tea and cigarettes, his mind constantly running through calculations and scenarios. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Every night that passed without his countermeasures in place was another night when British civilians died under precision German bombing. Jones would lie awake in his sparse bedroom, listening to the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns, knowing that somewhere out there German bombers were following their invisible beams to their targets, and there was nothing he could do to stop them yet. The moral dimension of his work haunted him. He was fighting a war through deception and technology, never seeing the enemy, never pulling a trigger, yet his decisions would determine who lived and who died. If his calculations were wrong, if his countermeasures failed, entire neighborhoods could be obliterated. If they worked too well, if the Germans realized what Britain was doing, they might respond with even more devastating attacks or deploy new weapons that Jones couldn't counter. Every choice carried enormous consequences, and there was no way to test his theories except in real combat conditions, with real lives hanging in the balance. By August 1940, Jones's first countermeasure system was operational. British transmitters, positioned strategically around the country, began detecting the German Knickerbein beams and subtly distorting them. The effect was gradual. Jones had deliberately designed the system to introduce errors slowly, so the German crews would attribute navigation discrepancies to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunctions rather than British interference. In the first few nights of operation, the results were difficult to measure. German bombers still found their targets, still dropped their payloads with terrifying accuracy. Jones monitored the reports anxiously, wondering if his system was working at all, wondering if he had miscalculated something fundamental. But then, gradually, patterns began to emerge. Bombs were falling slightly off target. Luftwaffe raids were reporting navigation difficulties. German pilot debriefings, intercepted through Ultra, mentioned unexpected signal fluctuations. Jones felt a cautious optimism. The system was working, at least partially. But the Germans were adapting too. By September, British intelligence detected references to a new, more sophisticated beam system called XJRAT-X device. This system used shorter wavelengths and more complex signal modulation, making it harder to detect and jam. XJRAT was being deployed with an elite Luftwaffe unit called Kampfgruppe 100, and their role was to act as pathfinders. They would arrive first, use XJRAT to locate the target with extreme precision, and drop incendiary bombs to mark the target for the main bomber force that would follow. It was beam navigation taken to the next level, and Jones realized with sinking certainty that his Knickerbein countermeasures would be useless against this new system. The race had intensified. Jones dove back into the intelligence, searching for any information about XJRAT. How did it work? What frequencies did it use? What were its vulnerabilities? The answers came in fragments. A prisoner interrogation here, a technical manual there, radio intercepts that hinted at operational procedures. Jones pieced it together gradually, working with his team through September and October, knowing that somewhere out there, Kampfgruppe 100 was preparing for a major operation, and if Jones couldn't counter XJRAT in time, the results would be catastrophic. The system turned out to be fiendishly clever. Unlike Knickerbein's two-beam approach, XJRAT used a single main beam with 3 cross beams. The bomber would fly along the main beam, and as it crossed each of the 3 cross beams in sequence, an onboard computer would calculate the exact moment to release the bombs based on the aircraft's speed and altitude. It was accurate to within a few hundred yards, extraordinary precision for the time, and it meant that even if Jones managed to distort the main beam, the cross beams would still give the Germans enough information to hit their targets. Countering XJRAT required a completely different approach. Jones couldn't simply bend one beam. He needed to manipulate multiple signals simultaneously while maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. The technical requirements were staggering, and he had a matter of weeks to make it work. He didn't make it in time. On November 14, 1940, the night Coventry was destroyed, Jones knew the attack was coming. British intelligence had detected unusual German preparations, and radio intercepts suggested that Kampfgruppe 100 was preparing for a major operation targeting a city codenamed Korn, which analysis indicated was Coventry. Jones's XJRAT countermeasures were not yet operational, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He spent that evening in his office, listening to the radio reports as they came in, each one worse than the last. The German bombers arrived in waves, guided by XJRAT with devastating accuracy. The Pathfinders came first, dropping incendiaries that turned the city center into an inferno. Then came the main force, over 400 bombers, dropping high explosives and more incendiaries, feeding the flames until Coventry became a firestorm that could be seen for miles. Jones listened to it all through the military radio network. The air raid sirens, the explosions, the desperate calls from civil defense units overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction. He heard reports of the medieval cathedral collapsing, its ancient stones turned to rubble by German bombs. He heard casualty estimates climbing throughout the night. Hundreds dead, thousands injured, tens of thousands homeless. And he knew with absolute certainty that this was his failure. He had warned them about the beams, had proven they existed, had built countermeasures for Knickerbein, but he had not moved fast enough to counter XJRAT, and now Coventry was paying the price. The morning after the Coventry raid, Jones walked through the ruins of his office, not literally but metaphorically. Papers everywhere, calculations scattered across every surface, the detritus of months of desperate work that had proven insufficient. He felt hollowed out, exhausted beyond measure, and for the first time since he had started this fight, he seriously considered whether he was the right person for this job. Maybe Lindemann had been right. Maybe he was too young, too inexperienced, too academic to handle the brutal realities of total war. But even as these thoughts circled his mind, another part of him was already working through the problem, analyzing what went wrong, calculating what needed to change. Coventry had been a tragedy, but it had also provided data. Jones now knew exactly how effective XJRAT was, knew its operational parameters, knew the limitations of his current countermeasures. And he knew that the Germans would use this system again, probably soon, probably against another major British city. He couldn't bring back the dead of Coventry, couldn't undo the damage, but he could make damn sure it didn't happen again. Within hours of the all-clear sounding over Coventry's smoking ruins, Jones was back at work with renewed determination. The Coventry raid became his galvanizing moment, the point where personal doubt transformed into furious resolve. He would beat XJRAT. He would bend those beams. He would take Hitler's secret weapon and turn it into a liability. Over the following weeks, Jones and his team worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They refined their understanding of XJRAT, built more sophisticated countermeasures, trained more radio operators, positioned transmitters at key locations across England. The new system they developed was called Bromide, and it represented a quantum leap in electronic warfare. Bromide worked by detecting the XJRAT crossbeams and then retransmitting false versions of those beams slightly ahead of the authentic signals. The German bomber's onboard computer would receive the false beams first, calculate its position based on those false signals, and trigger the bomb release mechanism too early. The bomber crew would never know they had been deceived. To them, everything would appear normal. The beams would be detected at the expected times, the computer would perform its calculations, the bombs would be released. Only later, when reconnaissance photos showed bombs falling in empty fields miles short of their intended targets, would the Germans realize something was wrong. And even then, Jones calculated, they would likely blame equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference before suspecting British countermeasures. By early December, Bromide was operational. Jones spent those nights in the operations room, surrounded by radio equipment and oscilloscopes, watching the green traces that represented German beam signals, listening to the static-filled reports from his field teams. When German bombers crossed the channel, Jones's operators would detect their XJRAT signals within minutes, lock onto the frequencies, and begin transmitting false beams. Jones would stand over their shoulders, watching the technical readouts, calculating in real time whether the deception was working. The first test came on December 8th, when Kampfgruppe 100 launched a raid against Birmingham. Jones tracked the operation from start to finish. The German pathfinders crossed the English coast right on schedule, their XJRAT receivers picking up the beams from continental transmitters. Jones's Bromide system detected the beams immediately and began its work, injecting false signals that would make the German bombers think they were further along their flight path than they actually were. Jones watched the technical indicators, barely breathing, as the German formation flew toward Birmingham. The critical moment came when the pathfinders should have dropped their incendiary markers over the city center. Jones's calculations suggested they would release their bombs early, landing in the countryside south of Birmingham. The minutes crawled by. Then the reports started coming in. Incendiary bombs falling in fields, no damage to Birmingham, confused German radio traffic asking why their markers had missed the target. Jones felt a wave of relief so powerful it was almost painful. It had worked. The system had actually worked. The pathfinders had been deceived, and without their markers to guide them, the main bomber force that followed had struggled to find Birmingham in the darkness. Some bombs still fell on the city. The Germans weren't completely helpless, but the raid was a fraction as effective as Coventry had been. British casualties were in the dozens rather than hundreds, and damage was minimal. For the first time since Jones had started this invisible war, he had definitively won a battle. The victories accumulated after that. Night after night, German bomber streams crossed the channel guided by X-Gerät, and night after night, Jones's Bromide system bent their invisible pathways, sending them off course. Bombs intended for Liverpool fell in the Irish Sea. Bombs aimed at Manchester landed in the Peak District. Bombs targeted at London's docks exploded in Essex farmland. The Germans knew something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. Their equipment was functioning normally, their crews were following procedures correctly, yet their navigation was increasingly unreliable. Luftwaffe intelligence suspected British interference but couldn't prove it and couldn't identify how it was being done. Jones's deception was working at multiple levels. Not only was he misdirecting German bombers, but he was doing it in a way that made the Germans doubt their own technology and their own competence. The psychological impact was significant. German bomber crews began losing confidence in their navigation systems, which made them more cautious, more hesitant, less effective even when the beams were not being jammed. Jones was winning the war not just by defeating German technology but by undermining German morale. But he never became complacent. He knew the Germans were resourceful, knew they would eventually develop new systems that would require new countermeasures. He was locked in a technological arms race with German scientists he would never meet, fighting battles in the electromagnetic spectrum that no one could see. The invisible war consumed Jones's life completely. There was no separation between work and everything else. No weekends, no holidays, no moments of relaxation. Even when he tried to sleep, his mind raced through calculations and scenarios. He lived in a world of radio frequencies and beam patterns, of intercepted signals and captured documents, of desperate improvisation and technical brilliance. His health suffered. He lost weight, developed a persistent cough from too many cigarettes, suffered from headaches and insomnia. His colleagues worried about him, but Jones brushed off their concerns. There would be time to rest after the war was won. For now, every moment spent not working was a moment the Germans could use to develop new weapons, new systems, new ways to kill British civilians. The pressure was relentless and unforgiving, and Jones drove himself with the kind of intensity that either breaks a person or transforms them into something harder, sharper, more focused. He became known throughout British intelligence circles as the man who fought the invisible war, the scientist who had beaten the German beams. But recognition brought no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment. Every victory was temporary, every success merely bought time until the next German innovation appeared. There was never any rest, never any certainty, never any moment when Jones could stop and say, "We've won, it's over, we're safe." The war went on night after night, an endless cycle of German attacks and British countermeasures, of technological thrust and parry, of silent battles fought in the crackling static of radio receivers. By 1941, the character of the air war was changing. The Luftwaffe's precision bombing campaign was faltering, undermined by Jones's beam-bending operations and Britain's increasingly effective air defenses. German losses were mounting, and Hitler was preparing to shift his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. The Blitz was winding down, though no one knew it at the time. Cities still burned, civilians still died, but the intensity was diminishing. Jones continued his work with the same driven focus, but the nature of the challenge was evolving. The Germans were moving away from beam navigation toward other technologies, radio-based navigation systems, improved bomb sights, new tactical approaches. Jones adapted, always staying one step ahead, always anticipating the next German move. His section expanded, growing from a handful of scientists into a substantial organization with hundreds of staff. Jones found himself managing not just technical challenges but administrative and political ones as well. He had to fight for resources, justify his budgets, navigate military bureaucracy, deal with inter-service rivalries. It was exhausting in a completely different way than the early days had been, when it was just him and a few colleagues working in near isolation. Success had brought visibility, and visibility brought complications. But through it all, Jones maintained his focus on the core mission, understanding German technology and developing ways to defeat it. He expanded his work beyond beam weapons to include radar countermeasures, radio intelligence, and analysis of German scientific capabilities. He became Britain's foremost expert on German military technology, the person everyone turned to when they needed to understand what the Germans were doing and how to stop them. The invisible war Jones fought was never officially acknowledged during the conflict. For security reasons, everything he did was classified at the highest levels. Even after individual operations succeeded, the details remained secret. The British people knew that German bombing was becoming less accurate, but they attributed it to improved air defenses and RAF fighters rather than to the silent work of scientists manipulating radio beams. Jones was fine with that. He had never sought glory or recognition. What drove him was not ambition but a kind of intellectual integrity, the need to solve problems, to understand how things worked, to take broken situations and fix them. The invisible war suited him because it was pure problem-solving stripped of all the pageantry and politics that surrounded conventional military operations. It was just him, his team, and the German scientists on the other side, engaged in a contest of minds where the only thing that mattered was who could think more cleverly, calculate more accurately, adapt more quickly. In that contest, Jones proved himself to be exceptional. His intuition for how radio systems worked, his ability to extrapolate from fragmentary intelligence to complete pictures, his willingness to trust his own conclusions even when everyone else doubted him, these qualities made him uniquely effective. But they also isolated him. He operated in a world most people couldn't understand, dealing with concepts and technologies that seemed like magic to anyone without advanced training in physics. Even among his colleagues, Jones was somewhat apart, his mind always working on problems that consumed his attention to the exclusion of everything else. As the war progressed and the immediate threat to Britain diminished, Jones turned his attention to offensive operations. If British science could defend against German technology, it could also develop weapons to attack German capabilities. Jones became involved in analyzing German radar systems, developing jamming techniques to blind German defenses, helping to plan electronic warfare operations that would support bomber raids into occupied Europe. The principles were the same: understand the enemy's technology, identify its vulnerabilities, exploit those vulnerabilities with precision and subtlety, but the applications were different. Jones was no longer just defending British cities. He was taking the fight to Germany, using invisible weapons to support the broader war effort. His work on radar countermeasures proved crucial during the later stages of the war, when Allied bombers began their strategic campaign against German industry. By jamming German radar and feeding false information into their defense networks, Jones's techniques helped to save thousands of Allied aircrew lives and dramatically increased the effectiveness of bombing raids. He was fighting the invisible war on multiple fronts now, and winning on all of them. But victory, when it finally came in 1945, felt strangely hollow. Jones had spent 5 years locked in an intense intellectual battle, had devoted everything to defeating German technology, and suddenly it was over. The enemy scientists he had been fighting against, never met, never seen, known only through their technical work, were now defeated, captured, or scattered. The beam systems that had once threatened to destroy British cities were relics, their transmitters silenced, their frequencies quiet. Jones found himself standing in a world that had moved on, where the urgency and intensity of wartime scientific work had been replaced by post-war reconstruction and demobilization. He was only 33 years old, but he felt ancient, worn down by 5 years of relentless pressure. The invisible war had taken something from him. Not his mind, which remained as sharp as ever, but something harder to define. Perhaps it was innocence, or perhaps it was the ability to see the world as anything other than a series of problems to be solved, threats to be countered, systems to be analyzed and defeated. In the years after the war, Jones struggled to adjust to peacetime. He returned to academic work, eventually becoming a professor at the University of Aberdeen, but civilian physics seemed pale and inconsequential compared to the life-and-death stakes of wartime scientific intelligence. He wrote about his experiences, eventually producing memoirs and technical papers that documented the invisible war he had fought. These writings were remarkably understated, technical in tone, focused on the systems and technologies rather than the human drama. Jones was not a man given to emotional displays or theatrical narratives. He presented the facts, explained the technical challenges, described the solutions his team had developed. But between the lines of his careful prose, it was possible to glimpse the weight he had carried, the sleepless nights, the moral burden of decisions made in the dark while cities burned overhead. Jones rarely spoke about the emotional toll of his work, rarely acknowledged the psychological cost of fighting a war where mistakes meant civilian deaths and success was measured in bombs that fell in empty fields instead of crowded neighborhoods. He had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the human consequences from the technical problems, because that was the only way to function in such a role. But the compartmentalization was never perfect, and in quiet moments the weight of it all came crashing back. Years later, long after the war had ended, Jones would sometimes walk through British cities and see the gaps in the skyline. Places where bombs had fallen, where buildings had been destroyed and never fully rebuilt. He would stand in those spaces and think about the invisible battles he had fought, about the beams he had bent and the bombs he had misdirected, and wonder about the calculus of it all. How many lives had he saved? Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands. But there were also the failures, Coventry most prominently, but other raids too where his countermeasures had been insufficient or had come too late. He never spoke about the guilt, but it was there, woven into the fabric of his memories. The invisible war had no clear victories, no moments of triumph where the enemy surrendered and everyone celebrated. It was a war of increments and probabilities, of raids that were slightly less devastating than they might have been, of bombers that missed their targets by miles instead of hitting them dead center. Jones had fought that war with equations and radio waves, with long nights in operations rooms watching oscilloscope traces, with the constant gnawing anxiety that the Germans would develop something new that he couldn't counter. And he had won more often than he lost, had proven that intelligence and scientific rigor could be as powerful as any weapon. But the cost was measured in years of his life consumed by urgency, in relationships neglected, in a youth spent fighting battles no one could see. The broader historical significance of Jones's work became clear only gradually, as the classified details of wartime scientific intelligence were slowly declassified over subsequent decades. Historians began to understand that the Battle of Britain and the Blitz had been fought on multiple levels, not just in the skies where RAF fighters dueled with Luftwaffe bombers, but also in the invisible electromagnetic spectrum where scientists like Jones waged a different kind of warfare. The Beam War, as it came to be called, represented one of the first examples of electronic warfare, a new form of combat that would become increasingly important in later conflicts. Jones had pioneered techniques and concepts that would shape military strategy for generations. The idea that you could defeat an enemy weapon not by destroying it but by deceiving it, by feeding it false information and turning it against itself, this was revolutionary. Jones had proven that the electromagnetic spectrum was a battlefield as real as any physical terrain, and that scientists could be warriors as effective as any soldiers. His work on the German beams had saved countless lives and had helped Britain survive during its darkest hour, when it stood alone against Nazi Germany and defeat seemed inevitable. Without Jones and his team, the Luftwaffe's precision bombing campaign would have been far more devastating, British casualties would have been far higher, and the outcome of the war might have been different. But Jones himself remained remarkably modest about his contributions. When asked about his wartime service, he would talk about the technical challenges, the clever solutions his team had devised, the cat-and-mouse game with German scientists. He deflected personal praise, emphasizing that it had been a team effort, that he had been one person among many working toward the same goal. This modesty was partly temperamental. Jones was not a man who sought the spotlight, but it also reflected a deeper truth. The invisible war had been fought by hundreds of people, most of whom would never be recognized or remembered. Radio operators who spent long nights monitoring frequencies, engineers who built and maintained the jamming equipment, intelligence analysts who pieced together fragments of information, military planners who decided how to deploy limited resources. All of them had played crucial roles. Jones had been the architect and strategist, the person who saw the big picture and devised the plans, but the execution required a vast infrastructure of skilled, dedicated people working in silence and secrecy. The invisible war was their war too, and Jones always insisted that any credit should be shared among all who had participated. In the decades after the war, as electronic warfare evolved and expanded, Jones's pioneering work became a foundation upon which entire fields of military science were built. Radar jamming, electronic countermeasures, signals intelligence, cyber warfare, all of these modern disciplines trace their roots back to the innovations Jones developed in his desperate race against German beam weapons. Military academies taught case studies about the Beam War, using Jones's tactics as examples of creative problem-solving and asymmetric warfare. The principles he established: understand your enemy's technology, identify vulnerabilities, develop countermeasures that are subtle enough to avoid detection, became core tenets of electronic warfare doctrine. Jones had not just won a series of battles. He had created a blueprint for how to fight in a new domain, how to weaponize intelligence and turn enemy technology into a liability. His legacy extended far beyond the specific German beam systems he had defeated. He had demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side with superior technology and scientific expertise held enormous advantages, and that investing in scientific intelligence was not a luxury but a necessity. The Invisible War Jones fought in 1940 and 1941 had proven that science mattered, that physicists and engineers could be as crucial to national defense as generals and admirals, and that the most effective weapons might be the ones no one could see. Yet, for all the historical recognition and professional accolades Jones eventually received, the personal cost remained. He had sacrificed years of his life to the Invisible War, had pushed himself to the edge of physical and mental exhaustion, had carried burdens that few others could understand. The intensity of those years, the constant pressure, the knowledge that lives depended on his calculations. These things marked him permanently. Even in peacetime, even in the quiet lecture halls of academia, Jones could never fully escape the memories of wartime operations rooms and the sound of distant bombers and the weight of responsibility that had pressed down on him night after night. He had learned things about himself during the war, about his capacity for sustained effort, about his ability to function under extreme pressure, about the reserves of determination he could draw upon when everything depended on being right. But he had also learned darker things about the nature of warfare, about how easily human lives could become abstract calculations, about the terrible arithmetic of deciding whose deaths were acceptable in pursuit of victory. These lessons stayed with him, informing his post-war work and shaping his views on science, warfare, and the moral responsibilities of scientists who work on military applications. Jones became an advocate for ethical scientific practice, arguing that scientists had a duty to consider the consequences of their work and to resist being used for immoral purposes. This stance was informed by his wartime experiences, by the years he had spent developing weapons, albeit defensive ones, and by his understanding of how easily scientific knowledge could be perverted to destructive ends. He had seen firsthand how science could be both a shield and a sword, how the same principles that allowed him to protect British cities could be used to destroy German ones, how the invisible war he had fought was morally complex in ways that traditional combat was not. When he bent the German beams, when he sent bombers off course to drop their payloads in empty fields, he was saving British lives. But he was also deceiving German pilots who were just following orders, just trying to complete their missions and survive to see their families again. The moral calculus was not simple, and Jones never pretended it was. He had done what needed to be done, had fought the invisible war because Britain's survival depended on it, but he never glorified it, never celebrated the deception and manipulation that had been his weapons. The invisible war had been necessary, but it had not been glorious, and Jones wanted people to understand that distinction. In his later years, Jones became something of a public intellectual, writing books and giving lectures about his wartime experiences and about the broader relationship between science and warfare. He spoke about the need for scientific literacy among military and political leaders, about the dangers of ignoring technical intelligence, about the importance of supporting basic research even when immediate applications were not obvious. His lectures were filled with stories from the Beam War, used as illustrations of larger principles. He would describe his 15-minute briefing to the Air Ministry, the moment when he had to convince skeptical officers that invisible radio beams were real, and use it to talk about the challenge of communicating complex technical information to non-specialists. He would recount the nights spent tracking German bomber streams, manipulating their guidance beams in real time, and use it to discuss the importance of remaining calm under pressure and trusting in careful preparation. He would describe the Coventry raid and its aftermath, and use it to explore questions about failure, persistence, and learning from mistakes. Through these stories, Jones tried to share not just the history of what had happened but the lessons he had drawn from it, the insights about science and war and human nature that his invisible war had taught him. But there was always something melancholy in these recollections, a sense of loss that Jones could never quite articulate. The invisible war had been the defining experience of his life, the period when he had been most intensely alive, when every decision mattered and every day brought new challenges that demanded the absolute best he could give. Everything that came after, the academic career, the honors and awards, the comfortable retirement, felt somehow diminished by comparison. Jones had touched something during those years that most people never experience, had operated at the absolute limit of his capabilities in pursuit of goals that were unambiguously important. He had been a warrior in a war of minds, had fought battles that existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum, had defeated enemies he never met through sheer intellectual superiority. That experience had been terrible and exhilarating in equal measure, and nothing else in his life would ever match its intensity. He was grateful to have survived it, grateful that Britain had survived it, but he also mourned the loss of that sense of purpose, that clarity of mission that had driven him through those desperate years. When Jones walked through London in his old age, through streets that had been rebuilt after the Blitz, past landmarks that bore no scars of the bombing they had endured, he would sometimes stop and remember. He would remember the sound of air raid sirens, the smell of smoke and cordite, the sight of fires burning across the horizon. He would remember nights in the operations room, watching oscilloscope traces and calculating beam angles while German bombers crossed the channel. He would remember the moment he first detected the Nicobine beam from that Anson aircraft, the surge of elation mixed with dread as he realized his theory was correct. He would remember Coventry burning, remember the reports of casualties and destruction, remember the crushing weight of failure and the determination that followed. He would remember the first time Bromide worked, the first time he bent an X-Gerrat beam and sent German bombs falling in empty fields, remember the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had won that round. All these memories would wash over him as he stood on rebuilt streets, and he would think about the invisible war he had fought, about the battles no one saw and few would ever understand. The war memorials scattered throughout Britain commemorated the soldiers who had died, the pilots who had fallen from the sky, the sailors who had gone down with their ships. There were no memorials to the invisible war, no monuments to the scientists who had fought with equations and radio waves. Jones was fine with that. The invisible war had been fought in silence and secrecy, and perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps some victories were meant to remain invisible, known only to those who had participated in them. But standing there in the rebuilt London of his old age, watching people hurry past on their way to ordinary peacetime lives, Jones would allow himself a moment of quiet pride. He had been part of something extraordinary, had contributed to one of the most important victories of the war, had proven that intelligence and scientific rigor could defeat even the most sophisticated weapons. The invisible war he had fought had saved countless lives, had helped Britain survive its darkest hour, had changed the nature of warfare forever. That was enough. That had to be enough. The young physicist who had stood in the Air Ministry in 1940, trying to convince skeptical officers that German radio beams were real, had become one of the most important figures in British wartime intelligence, had pioneered techniques that would shape electronic warfare for generations, had fought and won battles that few would ever see or understand. Reginald Victor Jones had waged an invisible war against Hitler's secret weapons, and he had won it not with bombs or bullets but with brilliance, determination, and an unshakable belief that science could be humanity's greatest weapon. The beam war was his war, the invisible war was his war, and though the world might never fully comprehend what he had done or how he had done it, Jones knew. He knew what he had achieved, knew the lives he had saved, knew the difference his work had made. And in the end, that knowledge was enough. The invisible war had been real, had been vital, had been won. Jones had been there, had been the architect of that victory, and nothing, not time, not the fading of memory, not the world's inevitable forgetting, could take that away from him. He had fought the war no one could see, and he had won it. And that quiet triumph echoed through the rebuilt streets of London like a ghostly radio beam, invisible but real, felt but not seen, a testament to the power of a single brilliant mind in humanity's darkest hour.